So welcome to the webinar on how to build credibility as a speaker and as a presenter. So Peter Dew's my name, and I'm a public speaking trainer and coach, and my absolute passion is helping people share their message confidently and effectively, and helping people overcome fear and any nerves or anxiety around public speaking, because there's nothing worse than having something that you wish to say and not being able to say it. Most of you looking through the names have been on webinars before, but just in case, please participate in the webinar. Ask questions as we go. 2 ways to ask questions at any time. Just type into the question dialog box and I will see that question and I'll answer it. I'll take questions as I go. Periodically I've got a question slide where I'm going to stop and pause and give you time to reflect on what we've covered and then ask any questions. Please take notes as we go, and I can make the recording of the webinar available to anyone who would like to review it. Also, probably the most powerful tool is to apply some of the information to your real life situation, and do that by thinking, how could have I used this in the past, in a previous presentation, in a previous workshop? How could have I developed credibility more effectively? Or what could have I done to enhance my credibility? Or think about an upcoming presentation that you will be delivering, or an upcoming facilitation that you have to do, and what could you use that will enhance your credibility? So that's how you get the most out of these webinars. And for those people just joining, we have just got underway. So credibility is part of the 4 C's that I often teach, and you have to have really good content. You need to connect with your audience. You need to be credible, and you need to have confidence. If any one of these 4 C's is lacking, then the impact that you have may be less than you hoped for. This webinar is about building your credibility. So it's about this area of the equation. How can you build credibility? How can you demonstrate that you've got good knowledge, that you can be trusted? Just remove that little drawing. Now it's important to realize that your credibility as a presenter, it's not something you do, it's not something you create, it's assigned by the group. The audience decides if you're credible or not. So you may think you're really credible, but if the audience doesn't perceive that credibility, then your credibility will not be developed. So slides are not moving forward. Why is that? Second slide. Let's have a look. Okay, I'm hoping you're now seeing the slides, the different slide. Thanks for pointing that out, Christine. It appears the slides were not working. So I was talking about having good content, having a great connection. Credibility is what we're talking about today. You need to be relatively confident, and this is how you have impact on your audience. Today is about the credibility part of this equation. So your credibility, it's assigned by the group that you're speaking to. It's the audience who decides your credibility. So this webinar is about what can you do to enhance your credibility in the eyes of the audience, in the eyes of those people you are trying to influence. Now, it could be that you think you're the most credible person in this particular topic, but if the audience doesn't see you as credible, then your impact will be diluted. So I just want to make that clear. It's the audience who determines your credibility, and you can do things that will make you appear credible or give the audience that right to assign credibility to you. And that's what this webinar is about. How can you enhance your credibility? Let me just spend a bit of time establishing the importance of credibility. If you've got the best message in the world, you know you're right, but you have no credibility, the world will not buy your message. The audience will not buy your message. You must establish that credibility before you go and sell, teach, persuade, move your audience to a new way of thinking. In the 1980s, there was a young West Australian scientist who worked out what caused peptic ulcers. Peptic ulcers are ulcers of the stomach, and in the 80s around the world, they killed about 1 million people a year around the world. Peptic ulcers, you would bleed and people would die. He discovered that there was a bacteria named Helicobacter pylori that caused peptic ulcers. And he also worked out there was an antibiotic that could cure this bacteria and then therefore stop peptic ulcers and therefore save 1 million lives a year around the world. It was the 1980s. He was a young scientist. So he took his findings, his discovery all around Australia and all around the world, and he shared them with the world for 8 years. Nobody believed him. Not one person believed him. And they said, everybody knows the stomach is full of hydrochloric acid. No way would bacteria survive within the stomach. Everybody knows peptic ulcers is caused from stress, from poor diet, from too much hydrochloric acid. Where's this young scientist from? Is he from King's College in London? No, he's not. Is he from Harvard Medical School in the United States? No, he's not. Is he from University of Sydney School of Medicine? No, he's not. Where is this young scientist from? Fremantle? Fremantle Hospital? Most people in the world had not even heard of Fremantle. And looking it up on the map said, no, this is not possible. No one in the world believed him. For 8 years he banged his head against the wall with his new scientific discovery and how to cure peptic ulcers. So in frustration, he went back to his laboratory in Fremantle and grew up in a beaker 1 billion bacteria, 1 billion Helicobacter pylori, and he drank it. 3 days after ingesting the Helicobacter pylori, he developed severe peptic ulcers. He had a colleague do endoscopies and take biopsies and showed the peptic ulcers. Then he treated himself with the antibiotic that he'd used to cure these peptic ulcers in rats and laboratory mice. And another 3 days later, his peptic ulcers were cured. So he took further endoscopies and further biopsies. Then he went back to the world and showed the world his new findings, and the world believed him. I'm talking about Professor Barry Marshall, the Nobel Prize winner for medicine. Peptic ulcers are now basically rid from the world because of his perseverance, his risk, his willingness to infect himself to prove that he was right. The point I'm making is, without credibility, people may not buy your message. Doesn't matter the fact that he was right, and that every year that people did not believe him, year 1, year 2, year 3, for 8 years, 1 million people died. So that's the importance of credibility. You need to establish credibility before your audience. So where does your credibility come from? Well, first of all, it's not just one thing. Your credibility needs to come from multiple layers, multiple pieces of evidence, and it's something you build up during a presentation, and it's something you build up with your audience. And I want to leave you with a term, and I want to call it your credibility stack. So how well you are trusted, how credible you are, how readily someone will buy your new message depends on your credibility stack. And so it's about layering different aspects of your credibility. So that's a bit of background. Now, how do you build your credibility stack? How do you enhance your credibility within your audience? And that's just a visual of your credibility stack. First of all, first impressions count. When your audience sees you, your stance, the way you're dressed, will determine your credibility. Very few people can go on stage wearing jeans and a black t-shirt. Steve Jobs was one of those people that was able to do all his presentations, his international presentations, wearing the jeans and his black polo t-shirt. But he'd done a lot of work before that to establish his credibility. With myself, and I suggest most of you, your first impressions do count, so you would dress appropriately for the audience. How do you stand? Are you standing confidently? Are you standing credibly? Malcolm Gladwell showed that with job interviews, the first 15 seconds of a job interview probably determines whether you're going to get the job or not. And he's talking about first impressions. He's talking about the way you look. He's talking about non-verbal communications. So give some thought about your first impressions. Where does your experience come from? So what qualifications, what previous work, what previous experiences can you bring to this forum, can you bring to your workshop or your facilitation that will enhance your credibility? And it can come from anywhere in your life. I've just got CV versus resume there. Your CV is your curriculum vitae, which is really the story of your entire life. So sometimes with your credibility, you will bring it from outside of your work. This may be your own struggle. I'm a public speaking trainer and coach. My background, my struggle is a person who stutters. Your own journey, your own overcoming adversity. There's an Australian trainer and speaker who works a lot with the mining sector. He's a school teacher by training, and he sort of has to build a connection and build some credibility with the mining sector. And one of the aspects that he uses is that he grew up in Kalgoorlie. So he's a mining town kid, and he went to high school in Kalgoorlie. Then he went to Perth for university and did all his career elsewhere. But that Kalgoorlie breaks down those barriers and all of a sudden builds a level or adds to his credibility stack. The fact that he's talking and working with miners, and he was brought up in a mining town. So he understands some of the stuff, some of the isolation, some of the safety risks. So what aspects of your experience can you highlight and can you weave in to build and add to your credibility stack? It doesn't always have to come from your direct career or your direct work. When you're using data, when you're quoting statistics, when you're giving information, make sure that you have a credible data source. And I've just listed a few of them there. Australian Bureau of Statistics, World Health Organization, UNESCO, the Cancer Council of Australia. If you're in the medical field, then there'll be clinical trials. Those overarching analyses, the meta-analysis that look at all the research in the area and conclude that something is correct or something is not correct. So there's a meta-analysis of mobile phone safety in terms of, do mobile phones cause brain tumours? And there's various research that indicates that there is a risk. But when they look at all of the research together and they pool it, the research shows that there is no scientific evidence that mobile phones do cause brain cancer. So where does your data come from? Important when you're facilitating and presenting to realise that many people in the room will have a smart device or an iPad and they can Google. So if you quote something, they can quickly go onto a website and find out, and then if you're not correct, then your credibility will diminish. So if you're going to use some data or statistics, it helps in terms of building credibility to quote a credible and a reputable source of that data. I'm going to pause for a moment. Please type in any questions or put your hand up and I can open up your microphone. So someone's put a comment, the concept of the credibility stack is very useful. And yes, that's really true. And if you hang your credibility on just one thing, so you've got a university degree, therefore you are an expert in the area you studied, that doesn't always work. So what else have you done? So what relevant research have you done? And we're going to talk about this later on. What publications have you published? Who else have you worked with? What other colleagues also support your position? So to some extent you borrow credibility. So the idea of a credibility stack is the right way to look at it. It's little bits of information that combined together give you in the audience's view, give you an overwhelming credibility rather than one thing, unless you're Steve Jobs, where your credibility is without a doubt. So another way to build your credibility stack is you need to write and publish. You need to create content to enhance your credibility. Credibility is about being expert, about being knowledgeable in the area which you're talking about. And if you're trying to create change or you're trying to create new ways of thinking, then where's the evidence that you are an expert in this field? Why should people follow you? You may need to write a book. It doesn't have to be a bestseller. It could be an e-book. You need to blog. People who write consistently in an area of their expertise, Google likes it and they will raise you in the ranking in terms of being an authority within that area. journal articles. Get your articles published. If you're an engineer or you work in the mining sector, if you work in the health sector, if you work in the disability sector, write some articles and get them published. And they can be in small state journals, they can be in national journals, and if you're really good, they can be within international journals. Do a podcast. I try to do a podcast every week where I record some information and then I upload it to iTunes, and then people can listen to my podcasts. But once again, this is content that I'm writing and I'm publishing. So when people look for fear of public speaking, my name comes up frequently. If you're a published author, straight away you have a little bit more credibility. And there's just a sample of my blog on my website, and I blog just about weekly. And there's a couple of samples of 2 books that I've written and published. One is about overcoming fear of public speaking. One is how to write a killer speech. Neither of those 2 books are best-selling books. I sell them online and I sell them through my workshops, and people find them very useful in working on their fear or working on creating a speech. So you need to create content. That adds to your credibility stack. Some further enhancers of credibility. Get testimonials. Testimonials, someone that's attended your workshop, someone you've coached, someone you've done some work with, someone you've co-researched with. Their testimonial saying how well the work went or how you helped them in their own journey or their own struggle adds to your credibility. On my website, I have quite a few testimonials. Get in the media. Just recently, Channel 9 asked me to comment on Colin Barnett's non-verbal communication. In the newspaper, the West Australian Premier, Colin Barnett, in the newspaper, he was being reported as being grumpy and being arrogant and being closed in his communication. And Channel 9 contacted me to comment on some video of Colin Barnett. So if you get in the media and people saw me, that adds to your credibility. And your client success stories, clients you've worked with that have turned their business around. These are further ways you can add credibility and enhance your credibility stack. Earlier on I mentioned borrowed credibility. Sometimes if you have a point of view that's a bit left field or a bit new or controversial, who else that's well known supports that view? So I've just used Stephen Covey here. Stephen Covey is probably, when he was alive, the world's #1 expert on effectiveness. And his famous book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And a couple of things that Stephen Covey said that I use in my workshops when I'm talking about the importance of listening and listening to understand. If you don't understand what someone's problem is, if you don't understand what someone's issues are, how can you address their problem? And Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So if you throw in that quote or research that someone else has done that supports your position, you're establishing credibility by borrowing credibility from an expert. Taking responsibility. Stephen Covey defined responsible as response able. And when I work in the area of overcoming fear, I talk to people about they're responsible, taking responsibility, and all sorts of things will happen to you. You'll be rejected, you'll be, told you're not good enough, but you're responsible and you're able to respond to what happens to you. And so they're the times when you can build credibility by borrowing data, information, quotes off someone else who is of high credibility themselves. So that's the concept of borrowed credibility. And when you're starting out and when you're new and maybe you don't have a lot of experience and maybe you haven't published yet and you haven't written blogs or podcasts, then you can borrow credibility. You're putting forward new ideas, a new way of thinking, and there are some other people in the world, highly recognized people, that also think along the same way. So draw the line between your thinking and this highly credible person's thinking. Borrowed credibility. Just going to pause for a moment. Any further questions? Any comments? Anyone have any examples of when they have or they could have borrowed some credibility from someone else? And thanks, Kyla. You've mentioned, I love the tip you give of yes and or yes but for using other content. And so what Kyla's talking about is when I read a book, I draw a line down a blank sheet of paper, and when I'm reading the content and I see something, I will write on one side yes but, which means yes I agree, but I also know something else. And the other side I'll put yes and, which means yes I agree and I can add to that. So the first one is yes but I know something different, and the other side is yes and I can add additional information. The yes but and the yes and becomes your unique intellectual property. So you're not just borrowing and regurgitating someone else's credibility, you're developing your own credibility by agreeing with them and adding another layer. So that's one way you can borrow credibility. And that's how you can develop your own intellectual property. Read journal articles, read books, and think, what else do I know about what that person has written? And it may be an expert. And then that particular aspect is your own intellectual property. When you borrow credibility also, and this is another good point, when you borrow credibility, and I'll just go back a slide, acknowledge the source of the data, acknowledge the source of the research, acknowledge the source of the quote. Stephen Covey said. So in talking about yes but and yes and, that comes from a colleague of mine called Matt Church. And he uses that template for developing your own intellectual property. Read profusely, and every time you can add a yes but and a yes and, write those down, and at the end when you look at that page, that's your intellectual property that you've developed from reading those resources. So thank you for that. Credibility comes from your alignment. Are you genuine and authentic? The financial planner who talks about solid investments and don't invest in depreciating assets, who drives a latest BMW. Probably their financial advice and who they are would be slightly out of sync. So do you walk and talk your message? Rather than just talk it, do you also walk it? Are you who you say you are? So this is about alignment. This is the credibility. And some credibility was brought into light, or lack of credibility was brought into light recently with Qantas. And Qantas's logo, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's about for the people of Australia, and that's their slogan, that's their logo. But with the recent happenings, putting off staff, moving their services over to Malaysia and overseas, and I'm not talking about, I'm not saying what they're doing is wrong from a business perspective, but their actions are not in line with what their key message is. Don't fake it, so make sure that your information and your message is what you know, and that you don't make it up. If you don't know questions, if you don't know the answers, then once again, don't make it up. If you did make it up, once again, someone could Google, someone could find out that you're just making it up. And research has shown that honesty is the #1 trait that people look to in their leaders and people in leadership roles. Honesty above problem-solving ability, above qualifications. So part of your alignment, part of being genuine, is being honest and authentic, and being genuine. Who you are, who you say you are, is who you really are. That is another way of adding to your credibility stack. Are you passionate about your topic? Are you passionate about the change management that you're speaking about, the new position, the new knowledge? It was Aristotle who said that all speakers must have pathos, and pathos is the emotion and the passion with which you, as a speaker, present. And you need to have that passion and the emotion and the energy. Without it, your credibility will suffer. Do you have the right level of passion? Sometimes, and this question comes up quite often, sometimes in a job, your role is to go out and train, do some change management, to downsize, to restructure, and it's your job, but really within your heart, you don't care, or you don't think it's the right answer, you don't think it's the right way forward, you personally don't think it's the right solution to the problem, but you are now tasked with going out and managing that change process, speaking it, being the messenger. Just realize that's a really tough gig to do, really tough for you to go out and have credibility and expect people to buy your message if you don't have that passion and that belief in your message yourself. So where possible, make sure you're aligned with your message and you're passionate about that message you are sharing with the audience. Your non-verbal communication can determine your credibility or not. I did some work with Michael Grinder in the United States of America. Michael Grinder is probably the world's #1 expert in non-verbal communication. And Michael Grinder shares this information about being credible. Now, sometimes when you're speaking, you want to be approachable, and when you're facilitating or when you want to build rapport and you want to connect, you need that level of approachability. But there are times when you're sending your information that you want to be credible, and your body language, if it's not credible, then your message will not have the impact. So credible body language is when you're speaking, your head is held still as opposed to bobbing up and down. When you're credible, you speak with a steady voice, and that voice deepens at the end of each sentence, as opposed to a fluctuating voice that rises up and down, and the inflection is up at the end of each sentence, which is the way many Australians speak. Very approachable, very nice, but lacking credibility. When you're standing before an audience with your palms facing up, you're inviting people to come on a journey. You're being very approachable. You're sharing. But that's not credible. So when you send information, your voice should change and your palms should be side on or facing down. Your eyes blink less when you're being credible. When you're being approachable, when you want to have a discussion, then your eyes blink more frequently. So your body and your body language is also determining, in the audience's perspective, how credible you are. Do you have a credible voice, or is your voice always approachable? Are your palms facing down sometimes, or are your palms facing up? It'd be worthwhile doing a small audit on your own nonverbal communication to see if you can be credible, and switch it to approachable when you don't wish to be credible. The approachability is generally at the beginning of a presentation. You may have, those of you who were on early, 5 minutes to 9, I was having a bit of a chat, I was sharing some information, and I was using an approachable voice. I wasn't sending information, I was just building rapport and connecting with those people that were on the webinar nice and early. When I get into the content, I need to be more credible with my voice and with my nonverbal communication, even though you cannot see me. Our previous Prime Minister sometimes did not enjoy the credibility with the Australian public that perhaps she deserved. And her head used to bounce up and down, which is approachable. Her hands would bounce up and down. Her fingers are apart. And she lacked, in the non-verbal sense, she lacked credibility. So Julia Gillard's non-verbal communication at times did not match the message and the impact that she was trying to have. And that gives you an example of how sometimes your non-verbal communication can detract from your message. She's a lawyer, a very clever lady, very knowledgeable, but just didn't seem to enjoy the credibility that perhaps she deserved at some times with the Australian people. And some of it had to do with her non-verbal communication. Any questions? Any other comments? So I've got a question, how can you, I mentioned a self-audit of your non-verbals, how can you do a self-audit? Probably the best way to try something new, and I'll just go back to that credibility slide. Let's say you want to be credible at certain aspects and then you want to be approachable. Practice in front of the mirror, or get someone to record you for maybe 5 minutes, and then you can review the video, just use your smartphone and then you can watch that on your laptop. But when you're trying something new, it's best to try it in a practice environment before you take it to a live audience. So at this stage, I would not look at this table and decide you're going to be more credible at a presentation you're doing tomorrow. What I'd suggest is try to be more credible practicing 5 minutes of that presentation in front of the mirror, and try with the steady voice and the palms down, and then try with the fluctuating voice and the palms up. And thanks, Christine. Christine's comment has commented that she loves the yes but and the yes and sometimes wonders where your knowledge comes from, as there's so many bits taken from so many places and so many other sources. And it's our unique experiences, our filters, as we read information, as we watch stuff on videos and YouTubes. Every time we can add our unique twist and add a little bit more, then that becomes our intellectual property, and we can share that experience and we can share that knowledge. Thanks, Christine. Okay, no more questions. So a further piece to your credibility stack: use language, use stories, use case studies that your audience can understand. This demonstrates that you've done your preparation, that you're committed to that audience, you understand the audience, you're speaking their language. That'll really enhance your credibility. So I mentioned my friend that grew up in Kalgoorlie. So some of the stories that he uses to build rapport and to connect and then move on to credibility are around the mining stories in Kalgoorlie, where he grew up. I work with health professionals, so some of the stories and the language I use, they relate to health professional stories. And some of you know that I worked in the health department for 30 years as a medical scientist. But I also work with financial planners and superannuation consultants. So when I talk about health stories, they don't work, they don't gel, they don't give me the same credibility with financial advisors and superannuation experts. So I've got another set of stories, and part of those stories are that when my father died, I was the executor of my father's will. Sorry, when my father died, he died without a will, and I had to help sort out his estate with my mother. And then when my mother died, I was the executor of my mother's will. And one of the first things that financial planners will tell you or ask you, have you got a will? Because if you don't have a will, all your financial planning could be at risk, because it may not be divided up. It may not protect your family. It may not protect your children the way you want it to. So a will is imperative. So straight away, the financial planners know that I have some experience and some understanding of the importance of having a will, and that helps me build credibility. So use the right language. What stories, what experiences are you going to use? What data, what information are you going to use for that particular audience? Different audiences, different language, different stories, different case studies. That'll enhance your credibility. For some audiences, so for me with the health department, with health professionals, it's a no-brainer. With me, for financial planners, I have to do extra work. I have to research. I have to learn a bit of their language. So the credibility doesn't come automatically. I have to work and earn that credibility with a different audience. I do a fair bit of work with water authorities in Victoria, in both Bendigo and also in Maffra. And luckily, part of my earlier life was as a water microbiologist. So I talk about water microbiology, quality of water drinking, potability of water, and I use those stories to gel with that audience. So that's another way you can build credibility. An audience will love it when you speak their language and you demonstrate that you've taken the time and the effort to learn about them and what their needs are. It's a great way to add to your credibility stack. So more on that, using the right language. So have a shared interest. Use the right jargon. Use the right acronyms. Tell the right stories, financial planning stories, water authority stories, health professional stories. Use relevant data. Use the right case studies. So I've mentioned your credibility stack. With your stories, with your case studies, with your data, with your evidence, you can also build a bank of evidence, a bank of stories, a bank of experiences that illustrate each point you want to make. And with this bank, you can then pick the right story that then matches the respective audience. So this is not part of this particular webinar, but when I talk about telling stories, I talk about building your bank of stories, and then you can select the right story for the right audience. Your energy level. Credibility can suffer if you come in at the wrong energy level. And the energy level really is quite simple, and it requires you to do your preparation. It's got to match that of the audience and then just add a little bit. So if you've got a fairly somber audience that's not high energy, don't come in jumping up and down, evangelical, you beauty, because you will lose the audience immediately and your credibility will be shot. If the audience is expectant, excited, new news, and they're in a state of anticipation, and you come in and you speak with no intonation, with a boring, low voice, and you just stand there with no energy, then you will quickly bring the audience down, and your credibility will also suffer. So credibility comes from having an energy level that matches that of the audience, but you still should be the most energized person in the room, but don't have a big gap. Now, the evangelical preacher, the rah, 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 jumping up and down, there's no reason you cannot build your audience up to that level as you connect and as your presentation goes on. And a lot of motivational speakers will come in at a fairly low level because the audience has had a long day and they're the end of the day motivational speaker. But by the end of their presentation, the audience will be really energized, really excited, and, standing ovations. You can't come in at that level, however. So important that you do come in at the right energy level. Just as an example, I was one of the speakers at a conference in Busselton. In fact, I was the second speaker. The first speaker, and it was at 8 a.m. in the morning, the first speaker was a world famous swimmer, world champion for 8 years in a row. And really high energized motivational speaker. And this was 8 a.m. in the morning, and it was a bunch of Shire workers, gardeners, maintenance workers and engineers, and the speaker came in jumping up and down on the floor and said, "Who's excited to be here? I'm really excited to be here. We're going to have a fantastic morning. Who's excited to be here?" And no one said anything. And her response was, "Well, you are a flat bunch of people if ever I saw one." She never got that crowd back. 8 a.m. in the morning, she came in just too high. I've seen her speak on other occasions and she's pitched it perfectly. But the room was energized. Don't shoot your credibility by coming in at the wrong energy level. So my call to action today, how are you going to build your credibility stack? From all the aspects I've touched on, borrowed credibility, using the right language, are you going to start to create content? You're going to work on your credible body language. Which aspects are you going to weave into your credibility stack so that you can be more credible the next time you speak? I just welcome some comments. I've still got a few minutes to go. What can you do to be more credible? And Kyle has put to blog more regularly, the occasional blog. And with your blog and your content, with your blog and your writing, I'm talking about content. So I do Facebook every day as well. But my Facebook is not telling you that I'm in a coffee shop catching up with friends. My Facebook is a post with content. It's a post with a tip. And what I often do is 7 tips to build credibility, and I'll do 1 tip every day. So those of you who follow me on Facebook, so Public Speaking Dynamics, not my personal Facebook page, and you can get that through my website, you'll get a tip every day. So it's content that builds credibility. And when you do create content, whether it's blogging or Facebook or podcasts, it raises your status on Google, and it also builds content for future books and for future resources. So one of the things with writing content was write a book. And I can imagine some of you saying, "Yeah, great, Peter, when am I ever going to write a book?" But one of the comments that Kyla has made is that once you've blogged about 20 times, you've probably got about 10 chapters of a book. So when you write a lot of content, you can then repurpose that content into a book, or it may be an e-book first, which is a shorter book, or a white paper. So yes, do create content, then people know about you. And then when someone inquires, "Peter, I'm thinking about employing you to do some work. Can you just give me a quote and tell me a little bit about how you would do this?" So I'll put the quote together, I'll give them a bit of a background, and I'll send them a free ebook for them to read. They haven't asked for the ebook, so they've now got my quote, they've now got how I'm going to do the work, and they've now got a free ebook, a resource that they can read. And I'll make that ebook available to everyone in the workshop. So it's a little bit of marketing, but it's also adding to my credibility. So Kyla's asked, what is a white paper? A white paper is probably 4 to 5 pages that is on a very tight topic, a very short topic. Now, our parliamentarians have white papers, so they're talking about a new disability insurance scheme. In fact, they've been talking about it for a long time. But when they first start to talk about that, someone will release a white paper. So a white paper is just 4 to 5 pages. It's content and it's smaller than an ebook. But once you've written several white papers, you can put them together. If the white papers are on related topics, you could easily compile 4 or 5 white papers into an ebook. So that's not a very good answer, but that's really what a white paper is. Okay. Lots of workshops coming up. As I mentioned earlier on at the start of my webinar, I've been in France for about 4 weeks at my daughter's wedding. So I'm back and working hard. So workshops in Perth, workshops in Karratha, workshops in Melbourne, and possibly a workshop in Sydney as well, workshops in Bunbury. Please have a look at my website. If you've got any colleagues or friends that you think might find the workshops advantageous, please forward my details to them and recommend they attend one of my workshops. In terms of the next webinar, Friday, September the 26th, the value of feedback when speaking and presenting, how to get feedback. And I've just mentioned briefly about credibility, practice in front of the mirror. That is indeed one way you can get some feedback. That's a free webinar, Friday, September the 26th. You're welcome to register. Any final questions?